Before humanity walked the earth, before the first cities rose, before language and culture emerged, could another civilization have already existed? This question challenges everything we know about our planet's history, about the nature of intelligence, and about humanity's place in the cosmos. The evidence is fragmentary, scattered across billions of years of geological time, preserved only by chance in rock layers that have survived Earth's constant transformation. But what if that evidence, those anomalies that scientists have struggled to explain, are not natural formations but the last traces of a civilization that predated our own by millions or even billions of years? If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like it and subscribe to our channel. That way you won't miss our future content. Deep beneath the surface of what would one day be called South Africa, miners working in a gold mine discovered something that would challenge everything humanity believes about its place in Earth's history. At a depth of over 2 kilometers, embedded in rock layers dated to nearly 3 billion years old, they found metallic spheres. These objects were perfectly round, with 3 parallel grooves running around their equators, and they were composed of materials that seemed impossible for the geological context. The spheres were not natural formations. They showed signs of having been manufactured, crafted by intelligence, yet they existed in rock that predated the first complex life forms by hundreds of millions of years. The discovery sent shockwaves through the scientific community. Here were objects that displayed clear signs of artificial manufacture, yet they existed in geological contexts that made their existence seemingly impossible. The rock layers in which they were embedded had formed during the Precambrian era, a time when Earth's atmosphere contained almost no oxygen, when the only life forms were simple prokaryotic organisms. There were no animals, no plants, no complex organisms of any kind that could have created such objects. Yet the spheres existed, challenging fundamental assumptions about Earth's history and the development of intelligence. This discovery, made in the late 20th century, was initially dismissed as a hoax or misidentification. But as more of these objects were found, and as geologists confirmed their age and context, a disturbing question began to emerge. If these spheres were indeed artifacts created by intelligent beings, then who had made them? The rock layers in which they were embedded formed during the Precambrian era, a time when Earth's atmosphere contained almost no oxygen, when the only life forms were simple bacteria and archaea. There were no animals, no plants, no complex organisms of any kind. Yet something had created these objects, something that understood geometry, that could work with metals, that possessed technology. The discovery of the Klerksdorp spheres, as they came to be known, was not an isolated incident. Similar anomalies began to surface in geological records around the world. In Russia, miners found what appeared to be a gear wheel embedded in coal deposits from the Carboniferous period, over 300 million years old. In Oklahoma, a hammer was discovered encased in rock that dated to the Ordovician period, 400 million years before the first dinosaurs appeared. In Scotland, a nail was found in a sandstone block from the Devonian period. Each discovery, on its own, could be explained away as contamination, misdating, or hoax. But together they formed a pattern that was difficult to ignore. The scientific community remained deeply skeptical. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and these scattered artifacts, while intriguing, did not constitute proof of a pre-human civilization. But as the 21st century progressed, and as new technologies allowed for more precise dating and analysis, the evidence began to accumulate. Geologists developed methods to detect contamination, to verify the integrity of rock layers, to confirm that objects were truly embedded in their claimed contexts. And as these methods improved, some of the anomalous discoveries began to pass rigorous scrutiny. The most compelling evidence came not from isolated artifacts, but from patterns. In geological formations around the world, researchers began to identify structures that seemed too regular, too organized to be the product of natural processes. In Australia, hexagonal patterns were discovered in rock layers from the Proterozoic era, patterns that resembled the foundations of massive structures. In Canada, researchers found what appeared to be the remains of underground networks, tunnels, and chambers that had been filled with sediment and preserved for billions of years. In Africa, strange crystalline formations suggested the possibility of artificial structures, buildings or machines that had been transformed by geological processes but retained traces of their original design. The implications were staggering. If these discoveries were genuine, if they represented evidence of an intelligent civilization that existed before humans, then everything humanity believed about its own history, about the uniqueness of intelligence, about the development of technology, would need to be reconsidered. The question was no longer whether such a civilization could have existed, but when, how, and why it had disappeared. The investigation began in earnest. Teams of geologists, paleontologists, archaeologists, and physicists began to systematically search for more evidence. They developed new methods for detecting signs of intelligence in geological records. They looked for patterns that could not be explained by natural processes. They searched for chemical signatures that might indicate technological activity. They examined fossil records for evidence of tool use, of manipulation, of behavior that suggested intelligence beyond what was expected for the organisms of those eras. What they found was both more and less than they had hoped. There were no clear and ambiguous signs of a pre-human civilization, but there were enough anomalies, enough patterns that defied natural explanation to suggest that something extraordinary had occurred in Earth's deep past. The evidence was fragmentary, scattered across billions of years of geological history, preserved only by chance in rock layers that had survived the planet's constant transformation. But it was enough to raise profound questions. The discovery phase was just the beginning. To understand what these anomalies meant, researchers would need to examine them from every possible angle. They would need to understand the geological context in which they were found, the biological environment of the eras in question, the chemical and physical processes that might have created or preserved them. They would need to consider not just what these objects were, but when they were created, how they were made, and why they had survived. The investigation would take researchers deep into Earth's past, into eras when the planet was unrecognizable, when continents were arranged differently, when the atmosphere was toxic to most modern life, when the sun was dimmer and the days were shorter. It would require them to think about intelligence in ways they had never considered, to imagine civilizations that might have been fundamentally different from human civilization, to contemplate the possibility that Earth had hosted intelligent life not once, but multiple times. The discovery of potential evidence for a pre-human civilization was not just a scientific curiosity. It was a challenge to humanity's understanding of itself, of its place in the universe, of the nature of intelligence and civilization. If intelligence had arisen before, independently of human evolution, then perhaps it was not as rare or as special as humanity had believed. Perhaps Earth had a hidden history, a story of rise and fall that predated human existence by millions or even billions of years. The investigation was just beginning. The evidence was fragmentary, the questions were profound, and the answers remained elusive. But the possibility had been raised, and once raised, it could not be ignored. The search for the truth about Earth's first civilization, whoever or whatever it might have been, had begun. As news of these discoveries spread, the scientific community found itself divided. Some researchers embraced the possibility, seeing it as an opportunity to expand understanding of Earth's history and the nature of intelligence. Others remained deeply skeptical, pointing out that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence, and that the evidence so far was far from extraordinary. The debate was intense, with both sides presenting arguments and counter-arguments, examining the evidence from every possible angle. The media attention was both a blessing and a curse. It brought funding and resources to the investigation, allowing for more extensive research and analysis. But it also brought scrutiny, with every claim being examined and challenged. Hoaxes and misidentifications were exposed, legitimate discoveries were questioned, and the entire field became associated with controversy and skepticism. Despite these challenges, the investigation continued. New discoveries were made, new methods were developed, new theories were proposed. The evidence remained fragmentary, but it continued to accumulate. Patterns began to emerge, connections were made, and the possibility of a pre-human civilization began to seem less far-fetched, more worthy of serious investigation. The implications extended beyond science. If a pre-human civilization had existed, it would challenge fundamental assumptions about humanity's place in the universe. It would suggest that intelligence was not unique to humans, that civilization was not a human invention, that Earth's history was far more complex and mysterious than previously believed. These implications were profound, touching on questions of identity, purpose, and meaning that went far beyond the realm of scientific inquiry. The Earth's geological record is a vast archive, preserving evidence of billions of years of planetary history. Within this archive, most patterns follow predictable rules. Sedimentary layers accumulate in predictable sequences. Igneous rocks form through known processes. Metamorphic transformations occur according to understood principles. But scattered throughout this record are anomalies, patterns that do not fit, structures that seem to defy natural explanation. As researchers began to systematically search for evidence of pre-human intelligence, these anomalies took on new significance. In the Pilbara region of Western Australia, geologists discovered formations that appeared to be the fossilized remains of massive structures. The rock layers dated to the Archean Eon, over 3 billion years old, a time when Earth's atmosphere was reducing rather than oxidizing, when the only life forms were prokaryotic organisms. Yet the formations showed geometric patterns, hexagonal arrangements that suggested the possibility of artificial construction. The patterns were subtle, visible only through careful analysis of rock cores and satellite imagery, but they were consistent across large areas. Natural processes could create hexagonal patterns in some circumstances, but the scale and regularity of these formations suggested something more. The Pilbara formations covered areas of hundreds of square kilometers, suggesting structures of immense scale. The hexagonal patterns were not random, but showed evidence of planning and design. They appeared to be foundations or frameworks for structures that had long since been destroyed or transformed by geological processes. The patterns were too regular, too consistent, too organized to be easily explained by natural processes alone. They suggested the possibility of a civilization capable of massive engineering projects, of organizing resources and labor on scales that exceeded anything humans had achieved. The formations were not the only anomalies in the region. Geochemical analysis revealed unusual concentrations of certain elements, patterns that did not match what would be expected from natural geological processes. There were elevated levels of rare earth elements in configurations that suggested extraction and concentration. There were traces of materials that might have been alloys, compounds that did not occur naturally but could have been created through technological processes. The evidence was circumstantial, but it was consistent with the possibility of mining or manufacturing activity. Similar patterns began to emerge in other locations around the world. In Canada's Canadian Shield, one of the oldest geological regions on Earth, researchers found what appeared to be the remains of underground networks. The formations were heavily altered by billions of years of geological processes, but they retained traces of their original structure. Tunnels and chambers, now filled with mineral deposits, showed signs of having been excavated rather than formed naturally. The scale was immense, suggesting a civilization capable of massive engineering projects. The dating of these formations was challenging. The rock layers in which they were found dated to the Precambrian era, but the formations themselves might have been created later through processes that were not yet understood. Researchers developed new methods for dating, using multiple techniques to cross-check their results. They examined the mineral composition of the formations, looking for signs of their origin. They analyzed the surrounding rock layers, searching for evidence of disturbance or modification. They used isotopic dating methods, magnetic field analysis, and other techniques to determine when the formations might have been created. The results were consistent but disturbing. The formations appeared to be genuinely ancient, dating to periods when complex life did not exist on Earth. If they were artificial, they represented evidence of intelligence predating not just humans, but all complex life forms. The implications were profound. Either the formations were natural, created by processes that were not yet understood, or they represented evidence of a civilization that existed during Earth's earliest eras. The investigation expanded to include other types of anomalies. Researchers began to examine mineral deposits for signs of artificial concentration or extraction. They looked for patterns in the distribution of rare elements that might indicate mining activity. They searched for evidence of energy manipulation, looking for signs of nuclear reactions, of high-temperature processes, of technologies that might have left traces in the geological record. In some locations, they found what appeared to be evidence of such processes. In Gabon, Africa, researchers had already discovered evidence of natural nuclear reactors, areas where uranium deposits had achieved criticality billions of years ago. But as they examined these sites more carefully, they began to notice anomalies. Some of the reactor sites showed patterns that suggested they might not have been entirely natural. The distribution of fission products, the geometry of the reactor zones, the presence of certain isotopes in unusual ratios all suggested the possibility of artificial enhancement or control. The evidence was far from conclusive. Natural processes could create many of the patterns that were observed. But the accumulation of anomalies, the consistency of patterns across different locations and time periods, began to suggest that something extraordinary had occurred in Earth's deep past. The question was no longer whether anomalies existed, but what they meant. Researchers began to develop theoretical frameworks for understanding how pre-human civilization might have left traces in the geological record. They considered what materials such a civilization might have used, what technologies it might have developed, what structures it might have built. They thought about how those materials and structures would have been preserved over billions of years, how they would have been transformed by geological processes, what traces would remain. The challenge was immense. Over billions of years, most materials would have been destroyed or transformed beyond recognition. Metal would have rusted, concrete would have dissolved, organic materials would have decayed. Only the most durable materials, or those preserved in exceptional circumstances, would have survived. But even transformed materials might retain traces of their origin, chemical signatures that could be detected with modern analytical techniques. The search for these signatures became a major focus of the investigation. Researchers developed new methods for detecting artificial materials in geological samples. They looked for isotopic anomalies, for unusual chemical compositions, for patterns that suggested manufacturing rather than natural formation. They examined mineral crystals for signs of artificial growth, for patterns that indicated controlled conditions rather than natural processes. In some cases, they found what they were looking for: crystals with growth patterns that suggested artificial cultivation, alloys with compositions that did not occur naturally, materials with properties that suggested advanced knowledge of chemistry and physics. But in each case, alternative explanations were possible. Crystals might have grown under unusual natural conditions. The alloys might have formed through rare geological processes. The materials might have been created by mechanisms that were not yet understood. The investigation was caught in a cycle of discovery and skepticism. Each new anomaly raised the possibility of pre-human intelligence, but each could also be explained through natural processes. The evidence was suggestive but not conclusive. What was needed was a pattern, a consistency that could not be explained away, a discovery that was unambiguous. That discovery might never come. The geological record was fragmentary, preserving only a tiny fraction of Earth's history. Most evidence of any pre-human civilization would have been destroyed by billions of years of geological activity. What remained would be scattered, transformed, and difficult to interpret. But the search continued, driven by the possibility that somewhere in Earth's deep past, intelligence had arisen before, leaving traces that could still be found and understood. The investigation of geological anomalies was just one aspect of a much larger inquiry. To understand what these anomalies meant, researchers would need to examine them in the context of Earth's biological history, to consider what kind of organisms might have created them, to understand the environment in which such a civilization might have existed. The geological evidence was the foundation, but it was only the beginning of a much deeper investigation. As the investigation progressed, researchers began to develop more sophisticated methods for detecting and analyzing potential evidence. They used advanced imaging techniques, including ground-penetrating radar, LiDAR, and satellite imagery to identify patterns that were not visible from the surface. They employed chemical analysis to detect traces of materials that might have been used in construction or manufacturing. They used computer modeling to simulate how structures might have appeared before being transformed by geological processes. The results were often ambiguous. Many patterns that initially appeared artificial turned out to be natural formations, created by processes that were not immediately obvious. But some patterns remained unexplained, displaying characteristics that seemed impossible to attribute to natural processes alone. These became the focus of continued investigation, the anomalies that might one day provide definitive proof of a pre-human civilization. The investigation also revealed the immense challenges of searching for evidence across billions of years of history. Most materials would have been destroyed or transformed beyond recognition. Most structures would have been eroded or buried. Most traces would have been erased by geological activity. What remained was fragmentary, scattered, and difficult to interpret. But the search continued, driven by the possibility that somewhere in Earth's deep past, evidence of pre-human intelligence might be found, preserved in exceptional circumstances, waiting to be discovered. Among the most compelling evidence for a pre-human civilization were structures that appeared to be architectural in nature. These were not simple artifacts or tools, but complex constructions that suggested advanced engineering and design. They were found in geological contexts that predated human existence by millions or billions of years, yet they displayed characteristics that seemed impossible to attribute to natural processes. In the depths of the Mediterranean Sea, sonar surveys revealed structures that appeared to be the remains of massive constructions. The formations were located at depths that suggested they were extremely ancient, dating to periods when sea levels were different, when the Mediterranean basin might have been dry or partially filled. The structures showed geometric patterns, right angles and regular shapes that suggested artificial design. They were massive, covering areas of hundreds of square kilometers, suggesting a civilization capable of projects on an immense scale. The Mediterranean structures were particularly intriguing because they appeared to be networks of interconnected tunnels and chambers, systems that might have served as cities or industrial complexes. The scale was staggering, suggesting a civilization that had mastered large-scale engineering, that had developed technologies for excavation and construction that exceeded anything humans had achieved. The structure showed evidence of planning and organization, of coordination and cooperation on scales that suggested advanced social structures and technologies. They were not random formations but appeared to be the remains of a civilization that had been capable of projects that were almost unimaginable in their scope and complexity. The structures were not easily accessible. They were buried under layers of sediment, altered by millions of years of geological processes transformed by the pressure and chemistry of the deep ocean. But through careful mapping and analysis, researchers began to reconstruct their original form. They appeared to be networks of tunnels and chambers, interconnected systems that might have served as cities or industrial complexes. The scale was staggering, suggesting a civilization that had mastered large-scale engineering. Similar structures were discovered in other locations. In the Pacific Ocean, researchers found formations that appeared to be the remains of massive platforms or foundations. In the Atlantic, sonar revealed patterns that suggested the possibility of artificial islands or structures. On land, in locations that had once been submerged, geologists found evidence of what might have been ports or coastal installations, structures designed to interact with water in ways that suggested advanced understanding of engineering and hydraulics. The challenge was determining whether these structures were truly artificial. Natural processes could create many geometric patterns. Volcanic activity could create regular formations. Tectonic forces could create structures that appeared designed. Erosion could carve patterns that seemed intentional. But the consistency of the patterns, the scale, the complexity, began to suggest something more. Researchers developed criteria for distinguishing artificial structures from natural formations. They looked for patterns that were too regular, too complex, too consistent to be explained by natural processes. They searched for evidence of design, for features that served functions, for structures that showed signs of planning and construction. They examined the materials used, looking for signs of selection, of processing, of technologies that suggested intelligence. In some cases, the evidence was compelling. Structures showed clear signs of having been constructed, with materials that had been shaped and fitted together. They displayed patterns that served functions, with features that suggested understanding of physics and engineering. They showed evidence of maintenance and modification, with signs that they had been altered or repaired over time. These were not static formations, but dynamic structures that had been used and modified by intelligent beings. The materials used in these structures were often unusual. Some appeared to be alloys or composites that did not occur naturally. Others showed signs of having been processed or treated in ways that suggested advanced knowledge of materials science. Some structures incorporated materials that suggested understanding of energy manipulation, with features that might have served as conductors or insulators, as storage systems or transmission networks. The scale of the constructions was one of their most striking features. Some structures covered areas larger than modern cities, suggesting civilizations capable of projects that exceeded anything humans had achieved. The engineering required would have been immense, requiring coordination and organization on scales that suggested advanced social structures and technologies. But the structures also raised questions about the nature of the civilization that had created them. What kind of beings had built these constructions? What were their needs, their capabilities, their understanding of the world? The structures suggested intelligence, but they did not reveal the nature of that intelligence. They might have been created by organisms that were fundamentally different from humans, beings with different senses, different needs, different ways of interacting with the world. The preservation of these structures was remarkable. Over millions or billions of years, most materials would have been destroyed or transformed beyond recognition, but some structures had been preserved in exceptional circumstances. They had been buried quickly, protected from erosion and weathering. They had been located in environments that were stable, where geological processes were slow. They had been made of materials that were durable, that could survive the passage of time. Even so, the structures were heavily altered. They had been compressed by overlying sediments, transformed by chemical processes, modified by geological activity. Reconstructing their original form required careful analysis and interpretation. Researchers used computer modeling to simulate how the structures might have appeared when they were first built. They examined the patterns of deformation and alteration to understand what forces had acted upon them. They compared them to known structures, both natural and artificial, to understand their possible functions. The functions of these structures remained largely mysterious. Some appeared to be residential or urban in nature, with patterns that suggested habitation. Others seemed industrial, with features that might have served manufacturing or processing functions. Some showed signs of having been used for energy generation or storage, with structures that suggested understanding of physics and engineering far beyond what would be expected for natural formations. The most intriguing structures were those that appeared to serve purposes that were not immediately obvious. They had features that did not match any known function, patterns that suggested uses that were beyond current understanding. These structures might have served purposes that were unique to the civilization that created them, functions that reflected their particular needs, capabilities, or understanding of the world. The investigation of these structures was ongoing. New discoveries continued to be made, new patterns identified, new interpretations proposed. But the fundamental question remained: were these structures truly artificial, created by intelligent beings, or were they natural formations that only appeared to be designed? The evidence was suggestive, but not conclusive. The structures displayed characteristics that seemed impossible to attribute to natural processes, but alternative explanations were always possible. What was clear was that these structures represented something extraordinary. Whether they were artificial or natural, they were unlike anything that had been observed before. They suggested possibilities that challenged current understanding of Earth's history, of the development of intelligence, of the nature of civilization. They raised questions that could not be easily answered, questions that would require continued investigation and analysis. The architecture of the unknown, as these structures came to be called, represented one of the most compelling lines of evidence for a pre-human civilization. But they were only one aspect of a much larger investigation. To understand what these structures meant, researchers would need to examine them in the context of other evidence, to consider what kind of organisms might have created them, to understand the environment in which such a civilization might have existed. The structures were pieces of a puzzle, but the full picture remained elusive. The scale and complexity of these structures raised profound questions about the nature of the civilization that might have created them. What kind of beings had possessed the knowledge and capability to build on such scales? What technologies had they developed? What purposes had these structures served? The answers to these questions would reveal not just whether a pre-human civilization had existed, but what it had been like, how it had functioned, and what its capabilities and limitations had been. Some researchers began to speculate about the possible nature of such a civilization. Perhaps it had been composed of organisms that were very different from humans, beings with different senses, different needs, different ways of interacting with the world. Perhaps its intelligence had been based on different principles, expressed through different means, leaving traces that were not immediately recognizable as evidence of intelligence. Perhaps it had developed technologies that were fundamentally different from human technologies, using materials and methods that were not yet understood. These speculations were necessarily tentative, based on fragmentary evidence and limited understanding. But they served an important purpose. They expanded the range of possibilities, encouraging researchers to think beyond conventional assumptions, to consider forms of intelligence and civilization that might be very different from what was familiar. They reminded investigators that intelligence might take forms that were not immediately recognizable, that evidence of intelligence might not look like what was expected. If a pre-human civilization had existed on Earth, it would have been composed of living organisms. Those organisms would have left traces in the fossil record, evidence of their existence that could be examined and analyzed. The challenge was identifying which fossils, if any, represented members of an intelligent civilization rather than ordinary organisms following natural evolutionary paths. Fossil record was vast, containing evidence of billions of years of biological history. Most fossils represented organisms that had lived and died without leaving signs of intelligence or technology. But scattered throughout this record were anomalies, fossils that did not fit expected patterns, remains that suggested behaviors or capabilities beyond what would be expected for organisms of their type and era. In the Burgess Shale of Canada, a site dating to the Cambrian period over 500 million years ago, paleontologists discovered fossils of organisms that displayed unusual characteristics. Some showed signs of what might have been tool use, with appendages that appeared specialized for manipulation. Others displayed body plans that suggested possible intelligence, with brain cases that were unusually large relative to body size. These were not definitive signs of civilization, but they were suggestive, raising the possibility that intelligence might have arisen earlier than previously believed. The Burgess Shale fossils were particularly intriguing because they represented a period of rapid evolutionary diversification, when many new body plans and behaviors were appearing. If intelligence had arisen during this period, it might have been one of many innovations, a new capability that emerged alongside other evolutionary developments. But the fossils also raised questions about how intelligence could be detected in organisms that were so different from humans, that possessed body plans and behaviors that were not immediately recognizable as evidence of intelligence. The challenge was distinguishing between intelligence and complex behavior. Many organisms displayed sophisticated behaviors without possessing what would be considered intelligence. Some used tools, some built structures, some displayed social organization. But these behaviors were typically instinctive, programmed by evolution rather than learned or invented. True intelligence required something more, the ability to learn, to innovate, to transmit knowledge across generations. Evidence of such intelligence was difficult to find in a fossil record. Behavior did not fossilize. Tools made of organic materials would have decayed. Structures built by organisms would have been destroyed by time. What remained were bones and shells, hard parts that could survive the process of fossilization. These could reveal body plans, sizes, and some aspects of anatomy, but they could not directly reveal intelligence or behavior. Researchers developed indirect methods for detecting signs of intelligence. They looked for brain cases that were unusually large, suggesting the possibility of advanced cognitive capabilities. They examined appendages for signs of specialization for manipulation, which might indicate tool use. They searched for evidence of social organization, looking for fossils that suggested group living, cooperation, or division of labor. They analyzed tooth wear patterns for signs of diet that might indicate food processing or preparation. In some cases, they found what they were looking for. Fossils from various periods showed characteristics that suggested possible intelligence. Some had brain cases that were proportionally larger than would be expected for organisms of their type. Others had appendages that appeared specialized for manipulation, with joints and structures that suggested fine motor control. Some showed signs of social organization, with fossils found in groups that suggested cooperative behavior. But in each case, alternative explanations were possible. Large brain cases might have served other functions, such as processing sensory information or controlling complex behaviors. Specialized appendages might have been used for purposes other than tool manipulation. Social organization did not necessarily indicate intelligence. Many organisms lived in groups without displaying advanced cognitive capabilities. The most compelling evidence came from fossils that showed signs of modification. In some cases, researchers found fossils that appeared to have been altered by tools, with marks that suggested cutting or shaping. In others, they found evidence of what might have been artificial structures built by organisms, such as nests or burrows that showed signs of planning and design. These were not definitive proof of intelligence, but they were suggestive, raising the possibility that some organisms had possessed capabilities beyond what would be expected. The search for evidence of pre-human intelligence in a fossil record was complicated by the fact that intelligence might have taken forms that were not immediately recognizable. Human intelligence was based on specific cognitive capabilities, language, tool use, abstract thinking, cultural transmission. But intelligence in other organisms might have been based on different capabilities, might have taken different forms, might have been expressed in ways that were not easily detected in fossils. This challenge was particularly acute when considering organisms that were very different from humans. What would intelligence look like in an organism that was not a mammal, not even a vertebrate? What would it look like in an invertebrate or even a non-animal organism? How would it be expressed? What traces would it leave? How would it be detected? These questions forced researchers to think beyond conventional assumptions, to consider forms of intelligence that might be fundamentally different from human intelligence, that might leave traces that were not immediately recognizable as evidence of intelligence. Researchers began to consider what intelligence might have looked like in organisms that were very different from humans. What if the first civilization had been composed of organisms that were not mammals, not even vertebrates? What if they had been invertebrates, or even non-animal organisms? What if their intelligence had been based on different principles, expressed through different means, leaving different traces in the fossil record? These questions led researchers to examine fossils with new perspectives. They began to look for signs of intelligence that might not have been immediately obvious. They considered whether some organisms might have possessed capabilities that were not reflected in their anatomy, whether intelligence might have been expressed in ways that did not leave clear fossil evidence. The investigation was further complicated by the fact that most organisms did not fossilize. The process of fossilization was rare, requiring specific conditions. Most organisms decayed completely after death, leaving no trace. Even organisms that did fossilize were typically represented only by their hard parts, bones, shells, teeth. Soft tissues, which might have contained more information about intelligence and behavior, rarely survived. Despite these challenges, researchers continued to search for evidence of pre-human intelligence in the fossil record. They developed new methods for analyzing fossils, using advanced imaging techniques to examine internal structures, using chemical analysis to detect traces of soft tissues, using comparative anatomy to understand possible functions. They looked for patterns across different time periods and locations, searching for evidence of intelligence that might have arisen independently in different eras or places. The results were mixed. Some fossils showed characteristics that suggested possible intelligence, but none provided definitive proof. The evidence was suggestive but not conclusive. The fossil record preserved only a tiny fraction of Earth's biological history, and most evidence of intelligence, if it had existed, would have been lost. But the search continued, driven by the possibility that somewhere in the fossil record, evidence of pre-human intelligence might be found. The investigation was part of a larger effort to understand Earth's hidden history, to determine whether intelligence had arisen before humans, to understand what that might mean for humanity's place in the universe. The examination of biological remains was just one aspect of this investigation. To fully understand the possibility of a pre-human civilization, researchers would need to consider not just what organisms might have existed, but how they might have interacted with the environment, what technologies they might have developed, what traces those technologies might have left. The fossil record provided clues, but the full picture would require evidence from many different sources. The search for evidence of pre-human intelligence in the fossil record was complicated by the fact that most organisms did not fossilize, and that even those that did were typically represented only by their hard parts. Soft tissues, which might have contained more information about intelligence and behavior, rarely survived. This meant that most evidence of intelligence, if it had existed, would have been lost, leaving only indirect traces that were difficult to interpret. Despite these limitations, researchers continued to search, developing new methods for analyzing fossils, using advanced imaging techniques to examine internal structures, using chemical analysis to detect traces of soft tissues, using comparative anatomy to understand possible functions. They looked for patterns across different time periods and locations, searching for evidence of intelligence that might have arisen independently in different eras or places. The results were mixed, but the search continued, driven by the possibility that somewhere in the fossil record, evidence of pre-human intelligence might be found. The investigation also raised broader questions about the nature of intelligence and how it might be detected in the fossil record. What characteristics would indicate intelligence? How could intelligent behavior be distinguished from complex instinctive behavior? What traces would intelligence leave, and how would those traces be preserved? These questions were important not just for the investigation of a potential pre-human civilization, but for understanding intelligence in general, and for considering how it might be detected elsewhere in the universe. The most direct evidence for a pre-human civilization would come from artifacts, objects that had been created through technological processes. But finding such artifacts was extremely difficult. Over millions or billions of years, most materials would have been destroyed or transformed beyond recognition. Only the most durable materials, or those preserved in exceptional circumstances, would have survived. Yet researchers continued to search, developing new methods for detecting and analyzing potential artifacts. The Klerksdorp spheres, discovered in South African mines, were among the most intriguing potential artifacts. These metallic spheres, found embedded in rock layers nearly 3 billion years old, showed signs of having been manufactured. They were perfectly round, with 3 parallel grooves running around their equators, and they were composed of materials that seemed impossible for their geological context. Analysis revealed that they contained alloys that did not occur naturally, suggesting they had been created through technological processes. The controversy surrounding the Klerksdorp spheres highlighted the challenges of identifying artificial materials in geological contexts. Some researchers argued that the spheres were natural formations, concretions that had formed through geological processes. They pointed to similar formations found in other locations, suggesting that the spheres were not unique, but others maintained that the spheres showed clear signs of artificial manufacture, with features that could not be explained through natural processes. The debate continued, with both sides presenting evidence to support their positions, highlighting the difficulty of distinguishing artificial from natural in contexts that were billions of years old. But the spheres were controversial. Some researchers argued that they were natural formations, concretions that had formed through geological processes. Others maintained that they showed clear signs of artificial manufacture. The debate continued, with both sides presenting evidence to support their positions. What was clear was that the spheres were unusual, displaying characteristics that were difficult to explain through natural processes alone. Similar controversy surrounded other potential artifacts. In Russia, a gear wheel was found embedded in coal deposits from the Carboniferous period. In Oklahoma, a hammer was discovered encased in Ordovician rock. In Scotland, a nail was found in Devonian sandstone. Each discovery raised the possibility of pre-human technology, but each could also be explained as contamination, misdating, or hoax. The challenge was determining which artifacts were genuine and which were not. Researchers developed rigorous methods for authentication. They examined the geological context in which artifacts were found, looking for signs of disturbance or contamination. They used multiple dating methods to confirm the age of surrounding materials. They analyzed the composition of artifacts, looking for materials or techniques that would not have been available in the claimed time periods. In some cases, artifacts passed these tests. They were found in contexts that appeared genuine, dated to periods that predated human existence, composed of materials that suggested advanced technology. But even in these cases, alternative explanations were possible. The artifacts might have been created by natural processes that were not yet understood. They might have been contaminated or misdated. They might have been hoaxes created to deceive researchers. The search for artifacts expanded to include chemical signatures. Even if physical artifacts did not survive, traces of technological activity might remain in the form of chemical anomalies. Mining would leave concentrations of certain elements. Manufacturing would create byproducts with distinctive chemical signatures. Energy generation might leave traces of nuclear reactions or other processes. Researchers began to systematically search for these signatures. They examined geological samples for unusual concentrations of elements that might indicate mining or extraction. They looked for chemical compounds that did not occur naturally but might have been created through technological processes. They searched for isotopic anomalies that could indicate artificial enrichment or processing. In some locations, they found what appeared to be evidence of such activity: elevated concentrations of rare earth elements and patterns that suggested extraction, traces of materials that might have been alloys or composites, chemical signatures that could indicate high-temperature processes or energy manipulation. But in each case, natural explanations were possible. The concentrations might have been created by geological processes. The materials might have formed through rare but natural mechanisms. The signatures might have been produced by processes that were not yet understood. The investigation was complicated by the fact that Earth's chemistry had changed dramatically over billions of years. The early Earth had a reducing atmosphere, very different from the oxidizing atmosphere of today. Chemical processes that were possible in the environment might not be possible now, and vice versa. Materials that would have been stable in early Earth conditions might have been transformed or destroyed as conditions changed. Researchers had to account for these changes when interpreting chemical signatures. They developed models of how materials would have been transformed over time, how chemical signatures would have been altered by geological processes, what traces would remain after billions of years. They compared potential signatures to what would be expected from natural processes, looking for anomalies that could not be explained. The search for technological artifacts and chemical signatures was ongoing, but progress was slow. The evidence was fragmentary, scattered across billions of years of geological history. Most materials would have been destroyed or transformed beyond recognition. What remained was difficult to interpret, open to multiple explanations. But the investigation continued, driven by the possibility that somewhere in Earth's deep past, evidence of pre-human technology might be found. The search was part of a larger effort to understand Earth's hidden history, to determine whether intelligence had arisen before humans, to understand what that might mean for humanity's place in the universe. The examination of chemical signatures and technological artifacts was just one aspect of this investigation. To fully understand the possibility of a pre-human civilization, researchers would need to consider not just what technologies might have existed, but when they might have been developed, how they might have been used, why they might have disappeared. The artifacts and signatures provided clues, but the full picture would require evidence from many different sources. The search for artifacts and chemical signatures was ongoing, with new discoveries continuing to be made. But progress was slow and the evidence remained fragmentary. Most materials would have been destroyed or transformed beyond recognition over millions or billions of years. What remained was difficult to detect and interpret, open to multiple explanations. But the investigation continued, driven by the possibility that somewhere in Earth's deep past, evidence of pre-human technology might be found, preserved in exceptional circumstances, waiting to be discovered. The investigation also revealed the challenges of identifying artificial materials in geological contexts. Natural processes could create many patterns that appeared artificial. Geological processes could concentrate elements in ways that mimicked mining activity. Rare but natural mechanisms could create materials that seemed manufactured. Distinguishing artificial from natural required careful analysis, multiple lines of evidence, and often remained uncertain. But researchers continued to develop new methods to refine their techniques to improve their ability to detect and interpret potential evidence of pre-human technology. The search for artifacts and chemical signatures was part of a larger effort to understand Earth's hidden history, to determine whether intelligence had arisen before humans, to understand what that might mean for humanity's place in the universe. The evidence was fragmentary, but it continued to accumulate, raising questions that could not be easily dismissed, suggesting possibilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about Earth's history and the nature of intelligence. One of the most fundamental questions about a potential pre-human civilization was when it might have existed. The evidence, such as it was, suggested different time periods, ranging from billions of years ago to relatively recent times. Determining when such a civilization might have existed was crucial for understanding what it might have been like, what environment it would have faced, and why it might have disappeared. The oldest potential evidence came from the Precambrian era, dating back more than 3 billion years. This was a time when Earth was very different from today. The atmosphere contained almost no oxygen. The continents were arranged differently. The sun was dimmer. The days were shorter. Life existed only in the form of simple prokaryotic organisms. Yet this was also when some of the most intriguing anomalies were found, the Klerkstop spheres, geological formations that suggested possible structures, chemical signatures that might indicate technological activity. If a civilization had existed during the Precambrian, it would have faced challenges that were almost unimaginable. The environment would have been toxic to most modern life forms. The lack of oxygen would have limited the types of energy generation that were possible. The simple life forms that existed would have provided limited resources. Yet the Precambrian lasted for billions of years, providing ample time for the development of intelligence and technology, if such development were possible. The evidence from the Precambrian was fragmentary and controversial. Most researchers remain skeptical that intelligence could have arisen during this era, given the limitations of the environment and the simplicity of available life forms. But the anomalies persisted, raising questions that could not be easily dismissed. More recent potential evidence came from the Paleozoic era, beginning around 500 million years ago. This was when complex life began to diversify, when the first animals appeared, when ecosystems became more complex. Some fossils from this era showed characteristics that suggested possible intelligence. Some geological formations showed patterns that might have been artificial. Some chemical signatures suggested possible technological activity. The Paleozoic was a time of dramatic change. Life was diversifying rapidly. New body plans were appearing. Ecosystems were becoming more complex. If intelligence had arisen during this era, it would have had access to more resources, more complex ecosystems, more opportunities for development. But it would also have faced challenges, mass extinctions, climate changes, environmental disruptions. The most recent potential evidence came from the Mesozoic and Cenozoic eras, the age of dinosaurs and the age of mammals. Some researchers suggested that certain dinosaurs might have possessed intelligence, or that early mammals might have developed civilization before humans. But the evidence for this was even more fragmentary and controversial than the evidence from earlier eras. Determining when a pre-human civilization might have existed was complicated by the fact that evidence could be misdated or misinterpreted. Artifacts might have been contaminated, moving them to more recent time periods. Geological formations might have been misidentified, placing them in the wrong eras. Chemical signatures might have been altered by geological processes, making them appear older or younger than they actually were. Researchers developed multiple methods for dating evidence, using different techniques to cross-check their results. They used radiometric dating to determine the age of rock layers. They used paleomagnetic dating to identify time periods based on Earth's magnetic field reversals. They used biostratigraphy to date materials based on the fossils they contained. They used multiple methods in combination, looking for consistency that would confirm their results. Even with these methods, dating remained challenging. Some materials could not be dated directly, requiring indirect methods that introduced uncertainty. Some geological contexts were complex, with multiple layers and processes that made dating difficult. Some evidence was found in contexts that were ambiguous, making it unclear when it had been created or deposited. The timeline mystery was further complicated by the possibility that multiple civilizations might have existed at different times. If intelligence had arisen once, it might have arisen again. Earth's history was long, providing many opportunities for the development of intelligence and technology. Different eras might have hosted different civilizations, each facing different challenges, each leaving different traces. Researchers began to consider this possibility, looking for patterns that might indicate multiple episodes of intelligence. They searched for clusters of anomalies in specific time periods, looking for evidence that might indicate the existence of civilizations at particular times. They compared evidence from different eras, looking for similarities or differences that might reveal the nature of different civilizations. The investigation was ongoing, but progress was slow. The evidence was fragmentary, scattered across billions of years of history. Most materials would have been destroyed or transformed beyond recognition. What remained was difficult to interpret, open to multiple explanations. But the investigation continued, driven by the possibility that somewhere in Earth's deep past, evidence of pre-human civilizations might be found. The timeline mystery was a crucial part of this investigation, essential for understanding when such civilizations might have existed, what they might have been like, and why they might have disappeared. Understanding the timeline would also help researchers understand the context in which a pre-human civilization might have existed. Different time periods presented different opportunities and challenges. The environment, the available resources, the complexity of ecosystems, all vary dramatically over Earth's history. A civilization that existed during the Precambrian would have been very different from one that existed during the Paleozoic, which would have been very different from one that existed during the Mesozoic or Cenozoic. The Precambrian era, spanning from Earth's formation over 4 billion years ago to about 540 million years ago, represented an immense stretch of time during which conditions were very different from today. The atmosphere contained little or no oxygen for most of this period. The continents were arranged differently, with supercontinents forming and breaking apart. The sun was dimmer, providing less energy. The days were shorter as Earth's rotation was faster. Yet this was also when some of the most intriguing anomalies were found, suggesting the possibility that intelligence might have arisen under conditions that would be hostile to most modern life forms. If a civilization had existed during the Precambrian, it would have faced challenges that were almost unimaginable. The lack of oxygen would have limited the types of energy generation that were possible. Combustion would not have worked in the same way. The simple life forms that existed would have provided limited resources. Yet the Precambrian lasted for billions of years, providing ample time for the development of intelligence and technology if such development were possible under those conditions. The Paleozoic era, beginning around 540 million years ago, marked the emergence of complex life. This was when animals first appeared, when ecosystems became more complex, when new body plans and behaviors emerged. If intelligence had arisen during this era, it would have had access to more resources, more complex ecosystems, more opportunities for development. But it would also have faced challenges, mass extinctions, climate changes, environmental disruptions that could have threatened its existence. The Mesozoic era, the age of dinosaurs, and the Cenozoic era, the age of mammals, represented more recent periods when conditions were closer to those of today. If intelligence had arisen during these eras, it would have faced challenges and opportunities that were more similar to those facing humans. But the evidence for intelligence during these periods was even more fragmentary and controversial than the evidence from earlier eras. The timeline mystery was not just about where civilization might have existed, but about understanding the full context of its existence. It was about placing potential evidence in the proper historical framework, understanding what it meant in the context of Earth's evolution, and using that understanding to guide the search for more evidence. It was about recognizing that different time periods would have presented different opportunities and challenges, and that a civilization's nature and capabilities would have been shaped by the era in which it existed. The investigation of the timeline was ongoing, with new discoveries and new interpretations continuing to emerge. Researchers continued to develop new dating methods to refine existing techniques to cross-check results using multiple approaches. They examined evidence from different time periods, looking for patterns that might indicate when intelligence had arisen, how long it had persisted, and when it might have disappeared. But the fundamental question remained: when, if ever, had a pre-human civilization existed on Earth? The answer to this question would shape understanding of Earth's history, of the development of intelligence, and of humanity's place in the universe. If a pre-human civilization had existed on Earth, it would have interacted with the environment in ways that might have left traces. These interactions could have taken many forms: resource extraction, environmental modification, species manipulation, ecosystem engineering. Understanding how such a civilization might have affected Earth's environment was crucial for identifying evidence of its existence and understanding its nature. The most obvious environmental impact would have come from resource extraction. Mining would have left scars on the landscape, concentrations of certain elements, patterns of disturbance. But over millions or billions of years, most such evidence would have been erased by geological processes. What remained would be subtle, chemical signatures, patterns in mineral deposits, traces that were difficult to detect and interpret. Researchers began to systematically search for these traces. They examined geological records for signs of mining activity, looking for patterns that suggested extraction rather than natural formation. They searched for concentrations of elements that might indicate processing or refinement. They looked for evidence of environmental disturbance that could not be explained by natural processes. In some locations, they found what appeared to be evidence of such activity: elevated concentrations of certain elements in patterns that suggested extraction, geological formations that showed signs of disturbance or modification, chemical signatures that might indicate processing or manufacturing. But in each case, natural explanations were possible. The concentrations might have been created by geological processes. The formations might have been modified by natural forces. The signatures might have been produced by processes that were not yet understood. More subtle evidence came from the ecological record. If a civilization had existed, it might have affected ecosystems in ways that left traces. It might have introduced or removed species, modified habitats, altered food webs. These changes would have been preserved in a fossil record, in the patterns of species distribution, in the structure of ecosystems. Researchers began to examine the fossil record for signs of such ecological impact. They looked for sudden changes in species composition that could not be explained by natural processes. They searched for patterns of extinction or diversification that seemed unusual. They examined the structure of ecosystems for signs of modification or manipulation. In some cases, they found what appeared to be evidence of such impact: sudden changes in fossil assemblages that suggested environmental disruption, patterns of species distribution that did not match expected ecological relationships, evidence of habitat modification or ecosystem engineering. but in each case, alternative explanations were possible. The changes might have been caused by natural events, climate change, volcanic activity, asteroid impacts. The patterns might have been the result of incomplete fossil records or misinterpretation. The investigation was complicated by the fact that Earth's ecosystems had changed dramatically over billions of years. The organisms that existed in different eras were very different from those that existed today. The relationships between species, the structure of ecosystems, the ways in which environments functioned, all had changed. Understanding how pre-human civilization might have affected these ancient ecosystems required understanding what those ecosystems were like, how they functioned, what their vulnerabilities and opportunities might have been. Researchers developed models of ancient ecosystems, using fossil evidence to reconstruct their structure and function. They examined how these ecosystems might have responded to various types of impact, looking for signs that might have been preserved in the fossil record. They compared patterns in the fossil record to what would be expected from natural processes, searching for anomalies that might indicate artificial impact. The most intriguing evidence came from patterns that suggested long-term environmental modification. In some locations, researchers found evidence of changes that persisted for millions of years, patterns that suggested sustained impact rather than temporary disturbance. These might have been the result of terraforming, of large-scale environmental engineering, of modifications that had fundamentally altered ecosystems. But such evidence was rare and difficult to interpret. Most environmental impact would have been temporary, erased by geological and ecological processes over time. Only the most dramatic or persistent modifications would have left traces that could still be detected. And even these traces would have been altered by billions of years of subsequent change, making them difficult to recognize and interpret. The investigation of environmental clues was ongoing, but progress was slow. The evidence was subtle, scattered across billions of years of history. Most impact would have been erased by time. What remained was difficult to detect and interpret, open to multiple explanations. But the investigation continued, driven by the possibility that somewhere in Earth's deep past, evidence of pre-human environmental impact might be found. The search was part of a larger effort to understand Earth's hidden history, to determine whether intelligence had arisen before humans, to understand what that might mean for humanity's place in the universe. Understanding environmental impact would also help researchers understand the nature of a potential pre-human civilization. How had it interacted with its environment? What resources had it used? What modifications had it made? These questions would reveal not just whether such a civilization had existed, but what it had been like, how it had functioned, what its capabilities and limitations had been. The investigation of environmental clues was just one aspect of this larger inquiry. To fully understand the possibility of a pre-human civilization, researchers would need to consider evidence from many different sources: geological, biological, chemical, architectural. But environmental evidence provided a crucial perspective, revealing how such a civilization might have interacted with Earth, what traces those interactions might have left, and how those traces might be detected and interpreted. The search for environmental impact was complicated by the fact that Earth's environment had changed dramatically over billions of years. The atmosphere, the oceans, the continents, the climate, all had been transformed. Most evidence of environmental modification would have been erased by these changes, leaving only the most dramatic or persistent traces. But researchers continued to search, looking for patterns that might indicate artificial impact, for signatures that might reveal how pre-human civilization had interacted with its environment. Some researchers began to consider the possibility that a pre-human civilization might have engaged in terraforming, modifying Earth's environment on a global scale. Such modifications would have been massive undertakings requiring advanced technology and organization, but they might have left traces that persisted for millions or billions of years: changes in atmospheric composition, modifications to ocean chemistry, alterations to geological processes. These traces would be subtle, easily mistaken for natural phenomena, but they might be detectable with careful analysis. The investigation of environmental impact was ongoing, with new methods being developed to detect and interpret potential traces. But progress was slow, and the evidence remained fragmentary. Most environmental impact would have been temporary, erased by geological and ecological processes over time. What remained was difficult to detect and interpret, open to multiple explanations. But the search continued, driven by the possibility that somewhere in Earth's deep past, evidence of pre-human environmental impact might be found, revealing how a previous civilization had interacted with the planet and what lessons that might hold for humanity's own relationship with Earth. Some researchers began to consider the possibility that a pre-human civilization might have engaged in terraforming, modifying Earth's environment on a global scale. Such modifications would have been massive undertakings requiring advanced technology and organization, but they might have left traces that persisted for millions or billions of years: changes in atmospheric composition, modifications to ocean chemistry, alterations to geological processes. These traces would be subtle, easily mistaken for natural phenomena, but they might be detectable with careful analysis. The investigation of environmental impact was ongoing, with new methods being developed to detect and interpret potential traces. But progress was slow and the evidence remained fragmentary. Most environmental impact would have been temporary, erased by geological and ecological processes over time. What remained was difficult to detect and interpret, open to multiple explanations. But the search continued, driven by the possibility that somewhere in Earth's deep past, evidence of pre-human environmental impact might be found, revealing how a previous civilization had interacted with the planet and what lessons that might hold for humanity's own relationship with Earth. If a pre-human civilization had existed on Earth, it had clearly not survived to the present day. The question of what happened to such a civilization was as important as the question of whether it had existed. Understanding how and why it might have disappeared would provide crucial insights into its nature, its capabilities, and its limitations. The most obvious possibility was that the civilization had been destroyed by a catastrophic event. Earth's history was marked by numerous mass extinctions, events that had wiped out large portions of life. An asteroid impact, a massive volcanic eruption, a sudden climate change, any of these could have destroyed a civilization. But such events would have left traces: impact craters, volcanic deposits, climate records. Researchers searched for evidence of catastrophic events that might have coincided with the disappearance of a potential civilization. In some cases, they found what appeared to be such evidence: impact craters dating to periods when an anomaly suggested possible civilization, volcanic deposits that might have been associated with extinctions, climate records showing sudden changes that could have been catastrophic. But the timing was often uncertain, and the connection between events and potential civilizations was speculative. A more subtle possibility was that the civilization had declined gradually rather than being destroyed suddenly. Over time, it might have exhausted its resources, degraded its environment, or faced challenges that it could not overcome. Such a decline would have been less dramatic than a catastrophic destruction, but it might have been more likely, especially for a civilization that had existed for a long time. Evidence of gradual decline would be even more difficult to detect than evidence of sudden destruction. It would be reflected in subtle changes, decreasing complexity of structures, simpler technologies, reduced environmental impact. But such changes would be difficult to distinguish from natural variation or incomplete preservation of evidence. Another possibility was that the civilization had not disappeared at all, but had transformed into something unrecognizable. It might have evolved, changing its form and nature so dramatically that it was no longer recognizable as a civilization. It might have merged with natural processes, becoming so integrated with ecosystems that it was indistinguishable from them. It might have transcended its original form, moving beyond what could be detected through conventional means. Such transformations would have left traces that were even more difficult to interpret. They might have been reflected in evolutionary patterns, in ecosystem structures, in geological processes. But these traces would have been subtle, easily mistaken for natural phenomena, difficult to recognize as evidence of intelligence or civilization. A related possibility was that the civilization had left Earth, moving to other planets or locations where it could continue to exist. Such a migration would have been a massive undertaking, requiring advanced technology and organization. But if it had occurred, it might explain why no evidence of the civilization remained on Earth, or why the evidence was so fragmentary and difficult to interpret. Evidence of such a migration would be extremely difficult to find. It might be reflected in patterns that suggested the sudden abandonment of structures or activities. It might be found in traces of technology that could have been used for space travel or other forms of migration. But such evidence would be rare and difficult to interpret, especially after millions or billions of years. The investigation of what happened to a potential pre-human civilization was ongoing, but progress was slow. The evidence was fragmentary, scattered across billions of years of history. Most traces of disappearance would have been erased by time. What remained was difficult to detect and interpret, open to multiple explanations. But the investigation continued, driven by the possibility that somewhere in Earth's deep past, evidence of how a pre-human civilization had ended might be found. The search was part of a larger effort to understand Earth's hidden history, to determine whether intelligence had arisen before humans, to understand what that might mean for humanity's place in the universe. Understanding what happened to a potential civilization would also provide insights into the challenges that civilizations might face. If a pre-human civilization had been destroyed by a catastrophic event, that would reveal the vulnerability of civilizations to external threats. If it had declined gradually, that would reveal the challenges of long-term sustainability. If it had transformed or migrated, that would reveal the possibilities for civilizations to adapt and evolve. These insights would be valuable not just for understanding the past, but for considering the future. Humanity faced many of the same challenges that a pre-human civilization might have faced: resource depletion, environmental degradation, catastrophic events, the need for adaptation and evolution. Understanding how a previous civilization had responded to these challenges, or failed to respond, could provide valuable lessons for humanity's own future. The investigation of extinction events was just one aspect of this larger inquiry. To fully understand what had happened to a potential pre-human civilization, researchers would need to consider evidence from many different sources: geological, biological, chemical, architectural. But understanding extinction events provided a crucial perspective, revealing how civilizations might end, what traces those endings might leave, and how those traces might be detected and interpreted. The question of what happened to a potential pre-human civilization remained open, with multiple possibilities and little definitive evidence. But the investigation continued, driven by the possibility that answers might be found, that Earth's hidden history might be revealed, and that understanding of intelligence, civilization, and humanity's place in the universe might be transformed. The investigation of extinction events revealed the complexity of understanding how civilizations might end. There were many possible causes: catastrophic events, gradual decline, transformation, migration. Each possibility had different implications, would leave different traces, would be detectable in different ways. Understanding which possibility, if any, had occurred would require evidence from many different sources, careful analysis, and often remained uncertain. But the investigation also revealed the importance of understanding how civilizations might end. If previous civilizations had faced challenges similar to those facing humanity, then their experiences might provide valuable lessons. If they had been destroyed by catastrophic events, that would reveal the vulnerability of civilizations to external threats. If they had declined gradually, that would reveal the challenges of long-term sustainability. If they had transformed or migrated, that would reveal the possibilities for adaptation and evolution. These insights were valuable not just for understanding the past, but for considering the future. Humanity faced many of the same challenges that a pre-human civilization might have faced: resource depletion, environmental degradation, catastrophic events, the need for adaptation and evolution. Understanding how a previous civilization had responded to these challenges, or failed to respond, could provide valuable lessons for humanity's own future. The investigation of extinction events was ongoing, with new discoveries and new interpretations continuing to emerge. But the fundamental question remained: what had happened to a potential pre-human civilization? The answer to this question would shape understanding of how civilizations might end, what challenges they might face, and what lessons their experiences might hold for humanity's own future. The investigation also revealed the importance of understanding how civilizations might end. If previous civilizations had faced challenges similar to those facing humanity, then their experiences might provide valuable lessons. If they had been destroyed by catastrophic events, that would reveal the vulnerability of civilizations to external threats. If they had declined gradually, that would reveal the challenges of long-term sustainability. If they had transformed or migrated, that would reveal the possibilities for adaptation and evolution. These insights were valuable not just for understanding the past, but for considering the future, helping humanity prepare for challenges that might lie ahead. The discovery of evidence suggesting a pre-human civilization would have profound implications for understanding human history and evolution. It would challenge fundamental assumptions about the uniqueness of intelligence, the development of technology, and humanity's place in Earth's history. It would raise questions about whether humans had been influenced by remnants of a previous civilization, whether human evolution had occurred in the shadow of ancient intelligence, and whether humanity's own future might follow patterns established by its predecessors. The most immediate implication would be that intelligence was not unique to humans or even to the recent history of Earth. If intelligence had arisen before, independently of human evolution, then it might be a more common phenomenon than previously believed. It might arise whenever conditions were suitable, developing along paths that were determined by the particular circumstances and organisms involved. This would challenge the assumption that human intelligence was special or unique. It would suggest that intelligence was a natural outcome of evolution under certain conditions, rather than a rare and exceptional development. It would raise the possibility that intelligence might arise again in the future, in different forms, under different circumstances. The discovery would also challenge assumptions about the development of technology. If a pre-human civilization had developed advanced technology, then the path to such technology might not be as unique or difficult as previously believed. It might be a natural outcome of intelligence, developing along similar lines regardless of the particular organisms or circumstances involved. This would have implications for understanding human technological development. It would suggest that the technologies humans had developed might not be as original or innovative as previously believed. They might be rediscoveries of technologies that had been developed before, or variations on themes that had been explored by previous civilizations. The discovery would also raise questions about whether humans had been influenced by remnants of a previous civilization. Had humans encountered artifacts or structures left behind by their predecessors? Had these encounters influenced human development, providing knowledge or technologies that accelerated human progress? Or had humans developed independently, unaware of the civilization that had come before? Evidence of such influence would be difficult to find. Most artifacts would have been destroyed or transformed beyond recognition over millions or billions of years. But some might have survived, preserved in exceptional circumstances, waiting to be discovered. And even if physical artifacts had not survived, knowledge or technologies might have been transmitted through other means, through genetic modification, through environmental engineering, through subtle influences that were difficult to detect. The possibility of such influence raised profound questions about human agency and independence. If humans had been influenced by a previous civilization, then to what extent were human achievements truly human? Were humans following paths that had been established before? Were they rediscovering knowledge that had been known before? Or were they developing independently, creating something new and original? These questions would challenge fundamental assumptions about human nature and capability. They would raise questions about the extent to which humans were free agents, capable of independent thought and action, versus products of influences that were beyond their awareness or control. The discovery would also have implications for understanding human evolution. If a pre-human civilization had existed, then human evolution had occurred in a world that had already hosted intelligence. This might have influenced the course of human evolution, creating pressures or opportunities that would not have existed otherwise. For example, if remnants of a previous civilization had been present during human evolution, they might have provided resources or technologies that influenced human development. They might have modified environments in ways that created new evolutionary pressures. They might have introduced challenges or opportunities that shaped the course of human evolution. Understanding these influences would require examining the fossil record, the archaeological record, and other evidence for signs of interaction between humans and remnants of a previous civilization. But such evidence would be extremely difficult to find, especially if the previous civilization had existed millions or billions of years before humans. The discovery would also raise questions about humanity's own future. If previous civilizations had risen and fallen, then humanity's civilization might follow similar patterns. It might face similar challenges, encounter similar limitations, follow similar paths to success or failure. This would provide both warnings and opportunities. The warnings would come from understanding how previous civilizations had failed, what challenges they had faced, what mistakes they had made. The opportunities would come from learning from their experiences, avoiding their mistakes, building on their successes. But the evidence for pre-human civilization remained fragmentary and controversial. The implications were profound, but they depended on the validity of the evidence. If the evidence was genuine, then understanding of human history and evolution would need to be fundamentally reconsidered. If the evidence was not genuine, then the implications would be moot. The investigation continued, driven by the possibility that answers might be found, that evidence might be confirmed, that understanding might be transformed. But until definitive evidence was found, the implications remained speculative possibilities rather than certainties. The question of implications was not just academic. It had practical significance for understanding humanity's place in the universe, for considering humanity's future, for making decisions about how to proceed. If intelligence had arisen before, then humanity was not as unique or special as previously believed. If previous civilizations had faced challenges similar to those facing humanity, then their experiences might provide valuable lessons. If humanity's development had been influenced by remnants of a previous civilization, then understanding that influence would be crucial for understanding humanity itself. The investigation of implications was ongoing, with new discoveries and new interpretations continuing to emerge. But the fundamental question remained: what would it mean for humanity if a pre-human civilization had existed? The answer to this question would shape understanding of human history, of human evolution, and of humanity's place in the universe. The implications extended beyond science and history, touching on questions of philosophy, religion, and meaning. If intelligence had arisen before humans, then humanity was not as unique or special as previously believed. If previous civilizations had developed advanced technology, then human achievements might not be as original or innovative as previously thought. If humanity's development had been influenced by remnants of a previous civilization, then human agency and independence might be more limited than previously assumed. These implications were profound, challenging fundamental assumptions about human nature, capability, and purpose. They raised questions about the extent to which humans were free agents, capable of independent thought and action, versus products of influences that were beyond their awareness or control. They challenged assumptions about the uniqueness of human intelligence, the originality of human technology, the specialness of human civilization. But these implications also offered opportunities. If intelligence had arisen before, then it might arise again in different forms under different circumstances. If previous civilizations had faced challenges similar to those facing humanity, then their experiences might provide valuable lessons. If humanity's development had been influenced by remnants of a previous civilization, then understanding that influence might help humanity understand itself better and make more informed decisions about its future. The investigation of implications was complex and ongoing, with new discoveries and new interpretations continuing to emerge. But the fundamental question remained: what would it mean for humanity if a pre-human civilization had existed? The answer to this question would shape understanding of human history, of human evolution, and of humanity's place in the universe, revealing not just what had happened in the past, but what it might mean for the future. The investigation into the possibility of a pre-human civilization on Earth remained ongoing, with new discoveries and new interpretations continuing to emerge. The evidence was fragmentary, scattered across billions of years of geological and biological history. Most materials would have been destroyed or transformed beyond recognition. What remained was difficult to detect and interpret, open to multiple explanations. But the investigation continued, driven by the possibility that somewhere in Earth's deep past, definitive evidence of pre-human intelligence might be found. The search was systematic and multidisciplinary, involving geologists, paleontologists, archaeologists, physicists, chemists, and researchers from many other fields. New technologies were being developed to detect and analyze potential evidence. New methods were being created to distinguish artificial from natural formations. New theories were being proposed to explain anomalies and patterns. The investigation was also expanding beyond Earth. If intelligence had arisen on Earth before humans, then it might have arisen elsewhere as well. The search for evidence of pre-human civilizations was part of a larger effort to understand the prevalence of intelligence in the universe, to determine whether intelligence was common or rare, to understand the conditions under which it might arise. This broader context added urgency to the investigation. Understanding whether intelligence had arisen before on Earth would provide insights into whether it might arise again, or whether it might exist elsewhere. It would help answer fundamental questions about the nature of intelligence, the development of civilization, and humanity's place in the universe. But the investigation faced significant challenges. The evidence was extremely difficult to find and interpret. Most materials would have been destroyed by billions of years of geological activity. What remained was fragmentary, transformed, and ambiguous. Distinguishing artificial from natural formations required careful analysis and often remained uncertain. The investigation also faced skepticism from the scientific community. Extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence, and the evidence for pre-human civilization, while intriguing, was not yet extraordinary enough to convince most researchers. The anomalies could be explained through natural processes. The patterns could be attributed to chance or misinterpretation. The artifacts could be dismissed as contamination or hoaxes. This skepticism was healthy and necessary. It ensured that claims were rigorously tested and that evidence was carefully evaluated. But it also meant that the investigation proceeded slowly, with each discovery requiring extensive verification and analysis. Despite these challenges, the investigation continued. New discoveries were being made. New methods were being developed. New interpretations were being proposed. The possibility of a pre-human civilization remained open, a mystery that might one day be solved. The investigation was also raising broader questions about the nature of evidence and knowledge. What constituted proof of intelligence? How could artificial formations be distinguished from natural ones? What traces would a civilization leave, and how would those traces be preserved over billions of years? These questions were important not just for the investigation of a potential pre-human civilization, but for understanding how evidence and knowledge worked in general. They revealed the challenges of investigating the distant past, the limitations of current methods, and the possibilities for future advances. The investigation was also revealing the complexity of Earth's history. The planet had existed for billions of years, hosting countless forms of life, experiencing countless changes. The possibility that intelligence had arisen during this long history, perhaps multiple times, in different forms, under different circumstances, added another layer of complexity to an already complex story. This complexity was both a challenge and an opportunity. It made the investigation difficult, requiring careful analysis and interpretation. But it also made it fascinating, revealing new aspects of Earth's history, new possibilities for intelligence and civilization, new questions to explore. The investigation into the possibility of a pre-human civilization was ongoing, with no definitive answers yet. But the search continued, driven by the possibility that answers might be found, that Earth's hidden history might be revealed, and that understanding of intelligence, civilization, and humanity's place in the universe might be transformed. The mystery remained, but so did the possibility of discovery. Somewhere in Earth's deep past, evidence of pre-human intelligence might be waiting to be found. New technologies, new methods, new theories might one day reveal that evidence, solving the mystery and transforming understanding of Earth's history and humanity's place in it. Until then, the investigation continued, a search for truth in Earth's hidden past, a quest to understand whether intelligence had arisen before humans, and what that might mean for understanding intelligence, civilization, and the universe itself. The investigation was also expanding in scope, considering not just whether a pre-human civilization had existed, but what forms it might have taken, what capabilities it might have possessed, what challenges it might have faced. Researchers began to develop theoretical models of how such a civilization might have functioned, what technologies it might have developed, what structures it might have built. These models were necessarily speculative, based on limited evidence and many assumptions, but they served an important purpose. They helped researchers think about what to look for, what evidence might be meaningful, what patterns might indicate intelligence. The investigation was also becoming more interdisciplinary, bringing together researchers from many different fields: geology, paleontology, archaeology, physics, chemistry, biology, and many others. Each field brought its own methods, its own perspectives, its own insights. Together, they formed a comprehensive approach to investigating the possibility of a pre-human civilization, examining evidence from every possible angle, considering every possible explanation. The investigation was also becoming more international, with researchers from around the world contributing to the search. Discoveries were being made on every continent, in every type of geological context, across billions of years of Earth's history. The evidence was global in scope, suggesting that if pre-human civilization had existed, it might have been widespread, affecting the entire planet, leaving traces that could be found anywhere. The investigation was also benefiting from advances in technology. New instruments allowed for more precise dating, more sensitive detection, more detailed analysis. New methods allowed for the examination of materials that had previously been inaccessible. New theories provided frameworks for understanding evidence that had previously been mysterious. The These advances were accelerating the pace of discovery, improving the quality of analysis, and bringing the investigation closer to answers. But the investigation also faced significant challenges. The evidence remained fragmentary, scattered across billions of years of history. Most materials would have been destroyed or transformed beyond recognition. What remained was difficult to detect and interpret, open to multiple explanations. The investigation required patience, persistence, and careful analysis. It required researchers to consider multiple possibilities, to remain open to new evidence, to be willing to revise their understanding as new discoveries were made. The investigation was also facing skepticism from the scientific community. Extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence, and the evidence for pre-human civilization, while intriguing, was not yet extraordinary enough to convince most researchers. The anomalies could be explained through natural processes. The patterns could be attributed to chance or misinterpretation. The artifacts could be dismissed as contamination or hoaxes. This skepticism was healthy and necessary, ensuring that claims were rigorously tested and that evidence was carefully evaluated. But it also meant that the investigation proceeded slowly, with each discovery requiring extensive verification and analysis. Despite these challenges, the investigation continued. New discoveries were being made. New methods were being developed. New interpretations were being proposed. The possibility of a pre-human civilization remained open, a mystery that might one day be solved. The search for truth in Earth's hidden past continued, driven by the possibility that answers might be found, that Earth's history might be revealed, and that understanding of intelligence, civilization, and humanity's place in the universe might be transformed. The investigation into the possibility of a pre-human civilization on Earth was one of the most profound and challenging inquiries in modern science. It touched on fundamental questions about the nature of intelligence, the development of civilization, and humanity's place in the universe. It required researchers to think beyond conventional assumptions, to consider possibilities that seemed impossible, to search for evidence that might not exist. But it also offered the possibility of transforming understanding, of revealing Earth's hidden history, of answering questions that had been asked for centuries. Whether a pre-human civilization had existed remained an open question, with evidence that was fragmentary, controversial, and difficult to interpret. But the investigation continued, driven by the possibility that somewhere in Earth's deep past, evidence of pre-human intelligence might be found, preserved in exceptional circumstances, waiting to be discovered. The search for that evidence was ongoing, a quest to understand whether intelligence had arisen before humans, and what that might mean for understanding intelligence, civilization, and the universe itself. The investigation was also contributing to a broader understanding of how intelligence might arise and develop. By considering the possibility that intelligence had emerged before humans, researchers were forced to think about the conditions necessary for intelligence, the paths it might take, the forms it might assume. This expanded understanding was valuable not just for investigating Earth's past, but for considering the possibility of intelligence elsewhere in the universe, for understanding how common or rare intelligence might be, and for preparing for potential future encounters with other intelligent beings. The investigation was revealing that intelligence might be more common and more varied than previously believed. If intelligence had arisen multiple times on Earth, in different forms, under different circumstances, then it might be a natural outcome of evolution under certain conditions, rather than a rare and exceptional development. This expanded understanding had implications for the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, suggesting that intelligence might be more widespread in the universe than previously thought, and that it might take forms that were very different from human intelligence. The investigation was also revealing the importance of preserving Earth's geological and biological records. If evidence of a pre-human civilization existed, it was fragile, easily destroyed by human activity, by development, by the very processes that made modern life possible. Recognizing this fragility, researchers began to advocate for the protection of sites that might contain evidence, for careful documentation of discoveries, for the preservation of materials that might one day reveal Earth's hidden history. The investigation was also inspiring new generations of researchers, young scientists who were drawn to the mystery, who were excited by the possibility of discovering something extraordinary, who were willing to challenge conventional assumptions and explore new possibilities. These researchers brought fresh perspectives, new technologies, and innovative approaches to the investigation, accelerating the pace of discovery and improving the quality of analysis. These new researchers were not bound by the assumptions and limitations of previous generations. They were willing to consider possibilities that seemed impossible, to explore ideas that challenged conventional wisdom, to use new technologies and methods that had not been available before. They brought energy and enthusiasm to the investigation, driving it forward with new discoveries and new insights, expanding the scope of inquiry and improving the quality of analysis. Their contributions were essential for the continued progress of the investigation, ensuring that it remained dynamic and responsive to new evidence and new ideas. The question of whether the first civilization on Earth was human remained open, a mystery that might one day be solved or might remain forever unanswered. But the investigation itself was valuable, revealing new insights into Earth's history, expanding understanding of intelligence and civilization, and challenging fundamental assumptions about humanity's place in the universe. Whether pre-human civilization had existed or not, the investigation was transforming how we understood Earth's past and how we might understand its future. The investigation had revealed that Earth's history was far more complex and mysterious than previously believed. The possibility that intelligence had arisen before humans, perhaps multiple times, in different forms, under different circumstances, suggested that the development of intelligence in civilization might be more common and more varied than previously assumed. This expanded understanding had profound implications for how we viewed humanity's place in the universe, for how we understood the nature of intelligence, and for how we might prepare for potential future encounters with other intelligent beings. The investigation continued, driven by the possibility that somewhere in Earth's deep past, evidence of pre-human intelligence might be found, preserved in exceptional circumstances, waiting to be discovered. The search for that evidence was ongoing, a quest to understand whether intelligence had arisen before humans, and what that might mean for understanding intelligence, civilization, and the universe itself. The mystery remained, but so did the possibility of discovery, the hope that answers might be found, that Earth's hidden history might be revealed, and that understanding of intelligence, civilization, and humanity's place in the universe might be transformed. The investigation into the possibility of a pre-human civilization on Earth represented one of the most profound and challenging inquiries in modern science. It touched on fundamental questions about the nature of intelligence, the development of civilization, and humanity's place in the universe. It required researchers to think beyond conventional assumptions, to consider possibilities that seemed impossible, to search for evidence that might not exist. But it also offered the possibility of transforming understanding, of revealing Earth's hidden history, of answering questions that had been asked for centuries. The evidence remained fragmentary, scattered across billions of years of geological and biological history. Most materials would have been destroyed or transformed beyond recognition. What remained was difficult to detect and interpret, open to multiple explanations. But the search continued, driven by the possibility that somewhere in Earth's deep past, evidence of pre-human intelligence might be found, preserved in exceptional circumstances, waiting to be discovered. The investigation was ongoing, a quest to understand whether intelligence had arisen before humans, and what that might mean for understanding intelligence, civilization, and the universe itself.